Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
So today I had my first encounter with an entitled mother, and I wouldn't want to repeat it. I live in a small coastal town near Alicante in Spain. Being a longboard enthusiast, I'd recently treated myself to a brand new Sector 9 Mirage Meridian board after saving up for months. Today's perfect weather made it an ideal beach day, so I decided to head to this hidden gem of a beach I know. It's this amazing spot that's half sand, half rock formations, which makes it perfect for longboarding since I can keep my board on the rocks without worrying about sand ruining the bearings. When I arrived, the beach was practically empty, just 3 people sunbathing and 1 person paddle surfing. I deliberately chose a spot away from everyone else, since I'm always a bit protective of my stuff when I'm in the water. I'd been swimming for maybe 10 minutes when this woman, let's call her Karen, showed up with 4 kids between 5 and 10 years old. Despite having the entire beach to choose from, they set up their spot about 8 meters from my belongings. I noticed 2 of her boys eyeing my longboard, so I started making my way back to shore, taking my time since they weren't touching anything yet. I got out and gave the kids a friendly greeting, showing them my board since they seemed interested. The kids asked if they could try riding it, and I explained nicely that longboarding isn't easy, plus the beach terrain wouldn't work for it. They seemed disappointed but understood and went back to their mom. Just 5 minutes later, Karen came stumbling over the rocks toward me with this smug look on her face. She demanded to know why I wouldn't let her kids try the board after they'd asked so politely. I explained that there were many reasons, but mainly the terrain wasn't suitable. She shot back that I shouldn't bring a toy to the beach if I wasn't okay with children wanting to play with it. I had to explain that this wasn't a toy, but rather an expensive longboard I used both for transportation and sport. I also said I was within my rights to not let her kids touch my property. She responded by calling me a rude young person and suggested my parents would be ashamed. I just told her to get lost. She stormed back to her towel, muttering curses. After a while, I decided to cool off in the water again, but this time I stayed close to shore and kept an eye on my stuff. That's when I saw Karen packing up and whispering something to her 2 older boys who'd been interested in my board earlier. I pretended not to notice but watched carefully. As soon as they thought I wasn't looking, the boys made a dash for my longboard. I sprinted out of the water, catching up to them just as they grabbed it. I took my board back from them probably less gently than I should have. Karen started screaming from where she stood, claiming I had assaulted her kid and stolen his skateboard. By now there were about 10 people on the beach, all staring at us. She threatened to call the police, bragging that her husband was in the Spanish military police. I told her to go ahead and call them, confident I could prove the board was mine. She insisted it wasn't mine, but rather a children's toy belonging to her kids. All her kids were crying at this point. I warned her that if she tried to take the board, I'd sue her so hard I could buy a whole collection of them. She then tried grabbing the board by the grip tape side, which was a rookie mistake since I had my hands on the trucks. When I pulled back, the grip tape scratched her palm. She started yelling about how I had scratched her hand and accused me of hitting a woman. I was furious but kept my cool. Being 6'1" and 24 years old, I towered over her 5'3" frame, and I wasn't about to get physical with a woman in front of her kids. Instead, I used my deepest, most intimidating voice to tell her to back off. Just then, 2 police officers on motorcycles noticed the commotion and came over. Karen immediately launched into her performance, thanking the officers for arriving and claiming I had assaulted her and her kids and stolen their toy. When the first officer asked if this was true, I denied it completely, explaining that she had tried to steal my longboard. I offered to prove it was mine with photos on my phone and the receipt in my email. One officer came with me to check my evidence while the other stayed with Karen. I showed him everything: photos, videos of me riding, the receipt, even my longboarding gloves in my backpack. When we returned, Karen was still spinning her tail. The officer confirmed the board was mine, but Karen wouldn't back down. She kept insisting it belonged to her kids until the officer finally shut her down, telling her that the board belonged to me and there was no doubt about it. I ended up pressing charges for attempted theft, and the officers even added a charge for filing a false police report. Karen left the beach screaming obscenities, dragging her crying kids behind her. Later, I found out through a friend who works at the courthouse that she got fined 500 euros for the false report and had to do 40 hours of community service for the attempted theft. I still go to that beach, but now I always bring a bike lock to secure my board to the rocks, just in case another entitled parent decides their precious children deserve my stuff more than I do. During my last few years of high school, I delivered newspapers every morning. The money wasn't great, but it was my first job. I really enjoyed the peace and quiet that comes with being awake before the sun rises. It was an enjoyable experience. However, there were downsides. For example, we had to go around once a month to collect payments, which was a real pain. If you can't get a customer to answer the door, they can't pay you. If a customer decided to simply stop paying you, there was nothing that you could do about it. The subscription could only be canceled by the customer themselves, so if someone decided not to pay you, the money was taken out of your earnings and the delivery person was the one stuck with the bill. Unfortunately, this was extremely common. This would eventually become the reason I quit, since I could not afford to work 2 hours a day and not get paid for it. One morning, as I arrived home from finishing my route, my mother was extremely agitated. My boss had called and woke her up 15 minutes earlier because he had started receiving calls from the paper saying that several customers on a route connected to mine had called to say they had not received their paper, and that this had happened several times this week, so he had to fire the person on that route. He wanted to know if I could take over the route. The route was only about half the size of the route I was currently doing and would only add about 30 minutes a day to my trip, so I agreed to take it. The first week passes pretty uneventfully. One morning during the second week of doing my new route, a few stops before I finish the route, as I am heading back over to my bike after hitting a string of houses, I hear a woman repeatedly calling out to get my attention in an increasingly agitated tone. I turn around to see a woman. She's coming down the driveway and holding a newspaper in one hand and using her free hand to try to pull the bottom of her t-shirt lower to preserve some sense of modesty. I recognize her as a substitute teacher at my high school. She demanded to know what the newspaper was, holding it up. I stood there confused for a moment before starting to address her as Ms. Karen, saying I didn't understand. She cut me off, telling me that she had already said that if they were going to fire her daughter for being a little late one day, then she didn't want the paper. Still confused, I apologized and explained that I had only had the route for a few days and wasn't the person she had spoken with, suggesting she might have talked to Mr. Boss instead. She responded smugly by asking how I knew her name if I wasn't the person she had spoken to before. I explained that I was one of her students and had been attending the high school where she taught for 4 years, and that she would need to call the subscription number to cancel as I couldn't do it for her. This obviously wasn't what she wanted to hear. She got really calm for a second, looked me in the eyes, and questioned my intelligence in a condescending tone before throwing the paper at me and turning around to waddle back up the driveway. I called my boss when I got home to tell him what happened and about her wanting her subscription cancelled. He explained that when he had called to fire her daughter, Karen had answered and screamed the same thing at him. He had also told her she needed to call the subscription line herself, as the teenage paperboy couldn't cancel it. He also revealed that when Karen's daughter took the job, Karen had told them that her daughter would be away every second weekend at her father's and wouldn't be able to deliver weekend papers, saying that she herself would handle those deliveries. The next Saturday, I received an updated subscription list and checked if her address was still on it. It meant that she still hadn't called the line to cancel, so I had no choice but to keep delivering the paper. This continued for a few more months until I was finally able to convince my boss to cancel her paper due to non-payment. One morning on a weekday, I accidentally slept in until about 4:30 a.m., which meant I had to rush to get them all delivered before 6:30. which is the cutoff time before a paper can be considered late. I deliver Karen's paper around 6:15, which, once again, is near the end of my route. This time, Karen comes running out and starts yelling about the late delivery, threatening to call the paper and get me fired just like they did to her daughter for being a little late one time. I tried explaining that, while the paper was later than usual, it was still before the 6:30 cutoff time and therefore not technically late. But Karen, true to form, wouldn't listen to reason. She taunted me about not being able to talk my way out of this one and gleefully predicted my firing before running back into her house laughing. About 2 hours later, I am sitting in class waiting for first period to start, and Miss Karen walks in to teach the class. She spots me immediately and begins shaking her finger in my direction, ordering me to leave and go to the office while repeatedly saying no. My entire class is baffled for 2 reasons. The first reason being that I was a pretty good kid and didn't get in trouble often, and the second reason being that it happened so quickly after her walking into the room that I couldn't have even had the time to misbehave in any way, shape, or form. I arrive at the principal's office and check in with the secretary. When she asked why I was there instead of in class, I acknowledged that while every kid probably claims innocence, I genuinely hadn't done anything wrong. I then explained the situation with Karen in the paper route, emphasizing that this was about something that happened outside of school during non-school hours. She looked at me slightly confused and then gestured to another girl sitting in the waiting room, asking if I knew her. I didn't. I had never seen her before. She was a pretty girl, maybe 2 years younger than me, with short bleach blonde hair, wearing a band tee with the sleeves cut off, and what had to be at least 10 bracelets on each wrist. I can't remember the band, but it was probably some 90s punk band. The fact that she had been crying was obvious. Her eye makeup had been running, and her face was red. I was sent to sit with her in the waiting area. She sat on the furthest right with 2 seats to her left. I followed urinal etiquette and took the seat on the left. As we sat there waiting to speak to the principal, she would periodically play with her bracelets and rings, which is how I caught a glimpse of the fresh purple bruise around her wrist. The principal's door opens, and after the secretary whispers something to him, he looks at me and asks me to come into his office. Now pretty girl's eyes light up with recognition as if she knows who I am. And it's at this point my foolish teenage self realizes that there is something bigger going on than me being kicked out of physics before the class even starts. The principal asked me what happened, and I explained the morning's events to the best of my ability. He thanked me and asked me to have a seat again. When I came out, the girl was gone. The principal asked the secretary about teacher availability, and she confirmed that Miss Math teacher was free and asked if she should page her. The principal agreed. The math teacher escorts me back to class and tells Miss Karen that she needs to go to the principal's office. We spent the rest of the class with a free period. I never saw Miss Karen again, and as far as I knew, that was the end of the story. Until a few years later, Pretty Girl ended up dating one of my friends, and I finally got to hear the rest of the story. Pretty Girl was Karen's daughter, and her parents were getting a divorce. Karen was a drunkie. Apparently, she had been the one to get her daughter the paper route because she thought having that job would mean her daughter would have to be at her house every night and never at her father's. Pretty Girl had tried the paper route and lived with her mom for a while, but being the mean drunkie that she was, crap deteriorated pretty quickly, and Pretty Girl wanted to go stay with her dad. When she did, there was no one to deliver those papers, and that's why she was fired. Not because they were a little late, but because around 50 newspapers had not been delivered several days in a row. Without the paper job, Karen had lost her imagined bargaining chip and was mad, which is why she decided I was public school enemy number 1, even though all I had done was accept more work. She thought getting me fired from a paper route I had been doing without complaint for 3 years would mean that her daughter would get the job back again. She had called the paper to complain about me, and despite them having probably told her that her paper was not late, she decided to drive over to Pretty Girl's dad's house and give her the good news that she was getting her job back and give her a lift to school. Pretty Girl had told her mom that she did not want the job or the lift and reminded her mother that she wasn't supposed to come over when her dad was not there. Karen didn't like that and dragged Pretty Girl, by her arm to the car. Pretty girl went straight to the office when classes started and asked them to call her dad. He had picked her up while she was in the principal's office. Apparently, what I told the principal was enough to corroborate Pretty Girl's story, which gave the principal what he needed to speak to the union and have her removed from my school's roster until Pretty Girl had graduated. That morning's event had also been a deciding factor in her dad getting full custody. This time, Karen did not get the kids. I'd been working at this tech company for about 4 years, and honestly, I was at my breaking point. When I first joined, it seemed like a dream job. Decent pay, good benefits, and what looked like room for growth. But as the years went by, things just kept getting worse. I started as a software developer, putting in extra hours and taking on additional projects. But in those 4 years, I never got a single performance evaluation. Every time I brought it up with my supervisor, they'd brush it off with excuses about getting to it next quarter or human resources restructuring the evaluation process. I was making $32 per hour, which wasn't terrible, but I knew something was off when a new hire accidentally left their offer letter on the printer. They were brought in at almost the same rate as me, but with zero experience. That's when I started looking elsewhere. The final straw came during the pandemic. While other companies were adapting and offering support to their employees, our management just kept piling on more work, always talking about maintaining productivity during these unprecedented times. More like they needed to maintain their bonuses. When I finally landed a new job with better pay and actual growth opportunities, I decided to make my exit memorable. I tried to schedule an exit interview, but the human resources representative dismissed my request, saying they would just slide a survey under my door. When I insisted on having a conversation about my experience, they simply stated that company policy had changed, and they were only doing written surveys now. During my last day, while downloading my important documents, I came across an organizational chart with everyone's email addresses. I exported it to a spreadsheet, cleaned it up, and saved it. Then I created a new Gmail account. I knew the company's email system accepted Gmail because we got emails from clients using it all the time. A week into my new job, I made my move. I crafted a simple email telling everyone I was a previous employee who made $32 per hour upon termination in 2020, and that I never received a performance evaluation in my 4 years with the company. I signed it as Furious in Florida. I said 2020 instead of 2021 to throw them off my trail. They'd fired quite a few people when COVID hit. The response was immediate. My old co-workers started messaging me on LinkedIn. One expressed shock about the salary, saying they were only making $27 after 5 years. Another mentioned that human resources was having an emergency meeting. Karen from accounting complained about how unprofessional it was, claiming we don't discuss salaries because it creates a hostile work environment. I simply suggested she seemed worried people might realize they're underpaid. The fallout was better than I expected. Within 2 weeks, Human Resources had to hold multiple department meetings to address salary concerns. They suddenly implemented a new performance evaluation system, and several people demanded raises. Some even started job hunting. They never figured out it was me. The Human Resources representative, who couldn't bother with my exit interview, was now drowning in internal complaints about salary disparities. They even hired a consultant to review their compensation structure and started requiring proper exit interviews for every leaving employee. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.